Welcome back to the Night Pitch, episode 15. I'm Justin Wick. On the far side of the screen is normal co-host Evan Johnson. And as you guys may recognize, this is no coincidence that we have two similar last names on the program this evening. I want to send a huge welcome to the young man in the middle of our screen. I was going to say the pride of Gilbert, Iowa, but then realized that that might be kind of a conflict of interest with the two people right now. So, number 2 pride of Gilbert, Iowa, current pitcher for Iowa Central Community College, an all-around gentleman, and as you can tell by the last names, this is going to be a young man that definitely knows his baseball. Welcome to the Night Pitch, Mr. Easton Johnson. Easton, how are you, my friend?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I'm finally able to join, and I'm glad to be here on episode 15.
Yeah.
Pumped.
Finally able to make it work. I'm not going to lie. I understand why your guys' voices sound similar, but every so often I'll hear Easton say something, and like the voice contrast. Like my brother and I don't have as similar of voices as you guys do. So it took me like several minutes to acclimate to this, and I think that makes it even more fun. But I want to talk a little bit about, the paths and the history of what you guys have done in baseball. And, Evan, we've highlighted plenty of yourself of course, growing up in Iowa. You played junior college ball in Iowa. You transferred to Creighton. Now, of course, you with the Mariners. Easton, in very similar fashion, kind of following in the footsteps of similar high school path. And now you're at the same junior college that Evan played at. So I want to speak more because I think there's a lot of people here that have a lot of affinity for the JUCO route. I want to talk about where you are at this point in time. Your guys' season, you're expected to get started here in a couple weeks, but how does it feel that, where you're at the present moment? Walk us through the training, the routines, the business that you've got going, and how are you feeling going into this upcoming season?
Right, yeah, I'm feeling great. We just got back from Christmas break probably 2 weeks ago. Right away we started with bullpens and live at-bats. We were already geared up for all that, but right now we're throwing a bullpen and live at-bats once a week, so just had that today actually, and it's been going pretty well. Just getting ready for Tennessee on February 16th is our first game.
Man, you guys are putting the miles down to get the season started. There you go, man.
Right.
This is a safe forum. I do want to kind of talk. Does it feel like you're in the period of the off season where it just never ends? Like it's going to be January 52nd, or does it seem like you're actually knocking on the door of getting started?
It seems like we're knocking on the door just because there's no practice limits at junior college, because there's not much time off. I think I spent my first year at Creighton and I redshirted there and then transferred here. So, I think just less downtime has really made it go by quicker and feel like that season is much closer than what you think.
Yeah, I think that's cool. And especially having done college before and this being year 2, I can think a lot of people reflect on the things that they learn when they leave the house for the first time or when they're really on their own in college for the first time. I think the advantages that presents just of the natural maturity of a baseball player, it's always fun to see, and it's always fun to tap into the expertise of when that really begins to take off, that is. And of course, it's fun to tap into the expertise of the co-host that we have here. Evan, my friend, I know that you have probably an endless wealth of knowledge on your brother, of course, and I want to preface this. I didn't tell you this on purpose because I just wanted to see how you would respond to this on the spot.
Right.
Is there anything that you want the people to know about your brother before this episode really takes off?
I want to say, regardless of sport, regardless of interest, just a heart of gold, man. Like, really. For the people that mean the most, just really a heart of gold. And hey, I am excited to see where he takes that in the future. And it's so fun to watch. It's just fun to watch him grow up because I've been watching him grow up since I've been a kid too. So it's awesome.
You took this super sentimental approach right here. I wasn't prepared for that. I was thinking you were gonna joke around, but that was the best. That was like the good half of like a best man speech right there, man.
Right.
We should set the bar really high for wherever this episode's gonna come out.
That's
So
what
anyways,
I think about first. So
That's the best. That's what it's all about, man. And I think this is cool, and something that I do really want to highlight, and I think that having the luxury of you two guys on this episode is talking about the relationships that are able to cultivate through several years. and seeing how so much of this is grounded in the game of baseball. So I can think of, I don't want to bore people with details of my own life, but I had very close cousins that progressed through baseball, and I think about the impact that they had on my life if I was able to look up to them and see that direct influence. I know the stories of course, Evan and I living together in college and hearing directly all of the stories about Easton, which, not to scare you, I know a lot more about you than you probably think, just because Evan talked as much about you as he did, of course.
That's great.
But I think that's part of the joy, and that's part of the real luxuries of where this goes. So I want to ask this open-ended on purpose, just because, I want to hear your guys' kind of opinion on this. But Ethan, as far as having somebody that you can certainly look up to, this is going to be kind of an elementary-based question, but feel free to take this any way that you like. As far as continually recognizing him a couple years older than you and seeing everything that he's been able to accomplish throughout these careers, what are some of the key takeaways that you've been able to develop? And as simple as it may sound, do you feel like you would be anywhere near the position that you're in right now if it weren't for your brother?
I mean, an easy answer to that is definitely not. I've always, dreamed of playing with Evan, and I know that's not really a great possibility since he's 6 years older than me, but in a sense we do play together. We talk about baseball all the time together. It seems like that's the only thing we talk about, but yeah, no, it's just super great to have him, in a sense by my side, and I just enjoy every moment that I've seen him go through, especially just because that helps me learn through my path too. And I just remember, going to his games and just watching from afar, and him not realizing that I was taking every single note of every detail that he did throughout practice, games, and just learning a lot from him in life and baseball. So
That's good. I want to kind of flip this on the other side, Evan, and realizing that, first of all, Easton, you are huge for being 6 years younger than Evan. I get that being this is something that I remember seeing you in high school and thinking to myself on this other side. I did want to throw that in there. But, I think about when you look at age differences and people that maybe you play with or play against, or as you're growing up, progressing through. Evan, I think this is something really unique as far as the age difference of, 6 years. Was this something that I can attest to, when I had people in the stands that would come and watch me play? If you're in the middle of a long season and now finally like somebody that's a close family member or a close friend's in the building, you kind of have a little bit of an extra pickup that day when you're like, this is some special stuff going on. And I can imagine with a brother that's 6 years younger than you, did it feel that way all the time? Like just realizing that you had that set of eyes that you could really pick up and somebody was admiring the work that you did, somebody was attentive and looking up to you in that capacity. I just think, was there always just this perpetual feeling of really putting that extra effort in to be your best because you always knew that set of eyes was looking up to you?
Yeah, and I think I was really hard on Easton too when he was little, just like playing in the backyard or doing something. We play wiffle ball, and he was 6 years younger, and I'd still just when I was pitching, I'd just burn one in there, or just just not have really any mercy on the situation. But I think that was a good thing because when Easton was younger, he was so far just in size and in ability, just from my dad, how into baseball he was, and just our family in general, like my grandpa and just everybody. Easton was far ahead of kids. I want to say kids below that age of like 12. He was really far ahead of them. So we would have high school practice, and Easton would go to a lot of those practices.
Oh, that's the best.
And sometimes we'd be out there, and we'd be out there early taking ground balls. We didn't have a first baseman. So we have high school juniors taking ground balls and doing infield. And then you have a kid who would be, how old? How old would he be?
Oh, man.
18? You're talking like 12 years old at that point? Like 12 years old with 18-year-olds?
Yeah. So he would be playing first, and we would be taking infield because he could handle it, We'd be burning stuff over there, and he'd be picking them and all sorts of stuff just because, like...
Well, it's at that point, he's underwhelmed when he goes back to his own team after having seen that.
Right.
I think this is something, and I can attest to, when you see baseball families, and this is something, I know that I had baseball players in my own family as well, there was a sign that was this was at my aunt and uncle's house, and they had like this playful sign that they hung up in their house, and it said, "We interrupt this family for baseball season." Just, I mean, that's what you do. If you're all over, that was what it was. So, I can attest to, of course, Evan and I think in very many respects, grew up in a very similar type of household. We had two brothers. I mean, it was my brother and I, and of course, the two of you guys in your household. And recognizing that, in my house, there was always baseball on. Me growing up in Denver, there was always the Rockies on TV. That we maybe weren't even locked into every single pitch, but it was just like, I mean, I can kid you not, assuming we were home, like all 162 games were on TV if we were in our house. That was just the way that it worked. And I can attest to the stories that you guys have told about road tripping to St. Louis and taking score while you're in the building, keeping track on all of these different details. I always like to really hear the differences in dynamics, and I think part of the reason I have this high affinity is because these stories remind me so much of my own upbringing. But I was the young brother, and Ethan and I being the same age, I'm sorry, Evan and I being the same age, it's like I can attest to the way Easton feels, but I'm all of a sudden living with Evan who can attest to the way that my brother feels, but it's just Evan and I are the same age in the middle of it. So this is the really cool side of things. Like, I mean, I think to myself of, this is going to sound super cheesy and kind of weird, but like anytime I had an update on what Easton was doing, I was thrilled because I just loved hearing those things because I knew it was a family that was basically an extension of the same thing that I was doing in my own house. So I want to talk about just living in the same house, the way that you guys were together. I mean, baseball was always a focal point, and I know that's the way that it was, but, did you ever really think to yourself that you guys were so much more vested in the game of baseball than other people, or was that the way? I'll turn this to Easton first, as far as, was it just so normal that it became almost just a second way of life of just you were so vested in the game of baseball? And, what was it kind of like just a day in the life in the Johnson household of what was the standard baseball operation there?
Right. I think it became the way of life for us just because throughout the day, we'd have school and whatnot. But after that, Evan and I, if he was home, we'd go to the park and do a bunch of baseball stuff. And then when Dad gets home, it's time for, practice, basically. So hitting us ground balls. And I think going back to me being able to practice with his team when he was on varsity level is because when I was younger, and when I was 6 years younger, working out with him when he was in, middle school or whatnot, and I was still only 6 or 8 years old, I think that really, helped introduce me to being able to work with older and progressing better with, older athletes. So I think that was what helped me a lot there. But just going back on the lifestyle, I think that, every day was just based on baseball all the time. And when we got done at the park, we'd come home, it'd be dark, and we watched the Cardinals on TV or whatever was on. But it was, all day long, and even at school, just waiting to get home to play catch and, go to the park fields. So
it's cool too because when it becomes such just a standard way of life and you realize that, I mean, this is what you do and it becomes second nature. Like I can remember, and I'm not trying to call out people that I grew up with, but when I was so familiar with the game of, I would get home from practice and there's still a baseball game on and I'm probably watching the recaps on MLB Network that night. That's what you do. You're a baseball guy. This is the way that it works. But I think about, when you're able to expand the perspective that really goes into it, and when you're able to have somebody that you can associate with that is just as bought in as you are. And I think that was, part of the reason Evan and I got along as well as we did when we got to college, when we first started living together, is because it was like this. I think it took us a little while to figure it out, but as soon as we figured out, like, this is almost identical, this is exactly what we grew up with, and now we're finally figuring out that this is like, it's like we were pointing fingers at each other going, we're the exact same lifestyle, but we just haven't
like the
figured this out
Spider-Man
any
meme.
sooner. Yeah, that's right. There you go. I think this is funny, and as far as, the path that you guys have picked up through, and I know that, of course, you guys playing now a couple years separated, of course, but choosing to go to the same junior college, and you guys have both played college summer ball in the Northwoods League as well, which would have killed to have had the chance to pitch in the Northwoods League as quickly as Easton did, by the way. That's like big shout out right there. Very nice. But, Evan, I'll kind of ask you about this of how does it feel seeing somebody experience what you have and having the luxury of doing that at such a high level? I imagine there's like a lot of nostalgia and a lot of easy reminiscing going on when you see how close that is to your story.
Yeah, it's fun. Like, he'll send me. I remember one time he sent me a video, and he goes, they were in Traverse. There's a certain way you're supposed to say it, Traverse, but he's in Traverse, and he was on the bus, and the AC went out. They were all sweating bullets. They had to take off their shirts and stuff. And he's texted me, and I'm like, "Oh, yep. Been there before." Or when he texts me, he's like, "Hey, we're gonna get back at 2:30 in the morning or 6 a.m. or something." Like, yep, absolutely. Like,
he's already prepared. Yeah, he's already seen it. And it's fun.
Yeah. It's fun because like I went through those same experiences. So now like I know and those are so unique. I guess like not a lot of people have the experience of getting back from a bus trip at 6 a.m. when the first half of it, your AC didn't work. Like not a lot of people have that experience, or trying to figure out like how like roommates in a hotel or whatever. And that is fun because now I am able to talk about it with somebody who, is in my own household.
Jeez, that is so much fun. I mean, honestly, like it's easy to be envious too, especially now as I reflect back on my times as a player. And I've thought about like how cool it would be of being able to play together. I know you guys have casually kind of mentioned this before, but I think about probably a similar figure in my life was my cousin Aaron. He played Division I ball in Michigan, and he's I want to say about 7 or 8 years older than I was. And I've always thought to myself like how cool it would be to actually play together. And to be in the trenches in the same dugout, being able to let that work. There was a chance that we were going to be playing against each other in a men's league tournament. That's a story for another time. But anyways, I want to add in there, and Easton, you talked about this as far as how cool it would be to actually play with Evan. And I know that, I imagine this is something that you certainly kind of think about, and I imagine something that comes to the forefront. But I'll keep this also open-ended. How would it feel, and what do you think it would be like to actually share a uniform with your older brother?
It would be a dream come true, honestly. But like I said earlier, it's almost as if we already are on the same team, just because we share so many thoughts and ideas together daily, honestly. And I think that it would just enhance that and grow that, bond together. I don't think it would make it a stronger bond because I don't think there is one, but I think that it would just be the dream come true, honestly. So
I think the linguistic ability right there, saying it's almost like we already are on the same team. If I'm not careful, I might be having my job taken from me, because that was about the most eloquent way to frame that. That was fantastic right there. It's fun to recognize it. I think that's part of the joy that really comes into it. And I mean, just seeing the enthusiasm that comes into, I remember when we were trying to figure out the guests that we wanted to line up on this show. And I was thinking, how do we create such a professional feeling? How do we create this to establish the show? And then I thought to myself, the purpose behind why we want to have this show is to highlight just the genuine purity of this game of baseball. And I'm trying to figure out what I like more, is hearing Easton's story or seeing Evan smile more on this episode than I think I've ever seen him smile.
That's probably true.
I mean, that's the best.
Definitely true.
It's so clean, it's so pure, and that's the way life is supposed to be right there, man. But it's fun to see. It's fun to see this come together, and of course, just an absolute joy to have this young man alongside another absolute joy and a co-host. Again, his name is Easton Johnson, pitcher for Iowa Central Community College, younger brother of your co-host, Evan Johnson. We are going to take a short break, but we're going to make sure Easton doesn't go anywhere, because we want to take a lot more casual approach into the second episode, just as if you found your way into the Johnson household while they were growing up. That's what we're really going for in the second half. So make sure you guys stick around. Thank you very much for tuning in. You are watching The Night Pitch. Power Minute, Justin Wick. It's time to use strikeout percentage instead of Ks per nine. 9 innings can be a lot of things. Let's say in a hypothetical world you just threw MLB's 24th perfect game with 15 strikeouts. Your Ks per nine is going to be an even 15. Now let's say a different game you face an average amount of hitters per game, that's around 33. If you strike out 15 of 33, you have an identical Ks per nine to the perfect game, but your K percentage is 10 percentage points different. Pretty clear to understand the perfect game is the better outing. So why isn't K percentage used more often? It gets things down to a more accurate denominator, but it's harder to interpret. That should not be an excuse. All you need to know, 22.8. That's the league average. Remember that number, 22.8. Base good or bad off of that figure, and you're on your way to understanding a superior stat. The best strikeout percentage in the league right now currently belongs to Carlos Rodon of the San Francisco Giants. He's got a 39.3. Best strikeout percentage by team is the Milwaukee Brewers at 28.6, and I guess that's what happens when you get a bunch of Cy Young finalists in your rotation. Welcome back to episode 15, the second half with our special guest, Easton Johnson. We spent a lot of time before the episode and throughout the break talking at length about the defining moments that really helped shape baseball enthusiasm and baseball passion in our own lives. And part of the joy of having two brothers on the program right now is that they're going to have a lot of similar stories, but they're going to have their own accounts of those similar stories, which is going to be very fun to compare and contrast where these defining moments really highlighted their love for the game. So, Easton, I want to turn this to you first, and my goal is to keep this very open-ended, and I admit this is going to rely heavily on you guys hopefully sharing the really cool moments, maybe the funny ones, maybe the crazy outlandish ones, maybe like the emotional ones, whatever it may be that you guys really bonded together and your love for the game really magnified and helped propel you guys into the situations that you're in right now. So I want to start with this. If you kind of can elaborate on, is there anything that you want the people to know about that was a defining baseball moment that at any point in time that was a defining baseball moment between both you and your brother that helped shape you to where you are today?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stories, but the first one I think of is it goes back to 2011. I think this is when the Cardinals won the World Series. I was probably 9 or so, but we were all watching
the David Freese series. Is that right?
Right, the David Freese series, but I don't have much memory of that game. It's the Game 7 that I remember a lot about. So we were all watching it in the living room, and I just remember being so locked in just because I really haven't seen a World Series. I know they won it in 2006, but I was 3 or 4 years old, so I didn't really remember much about that. But I think just being such a passionate Cardinal fan and baseball fan started here. But I just remember that final out. Jason Mott was pitching that day or closing it that game, and there was a deep fly ball to left field warning track, and I remember standing up and my heart just dropped because I thought it was going to be I think it might have been a game tying home run, or maybe they would have pulled in within 1. But anyway, he caught it at the warning track, and I just remember standing up, my heart dropped because I thought something bad was about to happen. And then I remember as soon as he caught it, we were all jumping around, hugging. And the first thing that Evan and I thought of to do was grab the Cardinal flag in the garage. And I remember running down the circle, and it's like 11:30 at night, down the circle. And I had no shirt on and my pajama pants on, and I was running the Cardinal flag down the circle at our street. And that is the first thing I think of when I think of what made me fall in love with baseball. But there's another one that I gotta share later, but that one was...
it was like the end of October or November. Was it like freezing cold and you don't have a shirt on?
Too hyped up.
Yeah. I had all the blood flow. I didn't need to worry about
all the blood flow.
Didn't need to worry about.
Evan, do you have a memorable account of this? Like, can you affirm this? And like, were you the onlooker that was? I mean, I imagine you were probably pretty elated too, growing up a Cardinal fan. But like, what's your memory? Like, do you remember vividly him actually doing this?
Oh yeah, no, that was accurate. We both did it. We had 2 big flags, and like, you know how they have like houses have those flag post stickers. They put it on the post of the front porch and sticks out at like a diagonal angle. We had a Cardinal flag on there, and then we had one in the garage. and we took off down the street. This is only a town of 500 people, so we're not causing too much of a ruckus. But we're running down the street with the two flags, and how old would I be? I was 14, 13?
Something like that.
Yeah, and Easton was, he would be like 8, and we were running down the street with the flags because we were so pumped up. Cool. And it was Game 6 that David Freese did I mean, people will remember the Joe Buck, we will see you tomorrow night kind of thing.
That's right. But, yeah, he matched his dad's call. Yeah, I remember that one. That's amazing to really piece together. I think that and this is something cool. I was happy that you guys tied this in as far as, the big league team that you follow and the aspirations that come with it. I don't want to talk too much of my own upbringing, but me growing up in Colorado, I was a Rockies fan. And very similar in pretense of, I remember in 2007, they made it to the World Series, and I was in 5th grade at the time. They got swept in 4 games, so I don't have any cool stories like you guys, but it is what it is. But I think of, having somebody to follow along with, and I think of the enthusiasm that comes with watching sports and having somebody that's along for the ride that matches the passion that you do. Like, I can think of times that, Evan and I are just hanging out watching baseball or talking about something that, it magnifies itself and it grows so much more when you have a counterpart that's into it just as much as you are. So, I mean, I wanted to throw that in there just because those memories stand out so much more because you have somebody that was just as locked in. And I think that's part of the really cool thing about realizing that you can't do it alone, that you really lean on other people to help develop your own enthusiasm. So I don't want to cut it off right there. I know you guys have a lot of these, and I don't want to turn this into just a checklist of making sure, like, what's another one? Because that's going to make me a really lazy host. But what's another one? What do you guys got for us?
I can go. I think what I love about baseball so much is just like there's such weird things and interesting things that happen in every little game and moment of every, season. And what made me really fall in love with that part of the game was it was Evan's senior year, his senior year of varsity baseball. And it was a home game against, I don't remember who it was, maybe CMB, but they had a really good pitcher and he probably throwing in the upper 80s or whatever. But I remember standing on the third base side, and I think it went into extra innings that day. It was bottom of the 8th maybe. But we had then our best hitter was, I don't know if he's watching, Jared Scheidler. He was up at the plate against this, the big mean pitcher that was throwing hard. And there was, I think, a runner on second maybe. But I just remember him insiding out like the softest little ground ball to first base. And it went between the first baseman's legs. And it was like super, super long grass in the infield. And I don't even know how it got through. But it went through his legs like, the Buckner play, the infamous Bill Buckner play. And we scored, and there was a walk-off on that. And I just remember falling in love at that moment of just the craziest plays that can happen in baseball. And such, he hit the softest ball I've ever seen, and it won the game. And there was many hard hit balls that day.
It's true.
Yeah.
And you're a 7th grader as an onlooker checking this. I mean, imagine how the first baseman felt too. If that first baseman's actually watching this, I mean, at least there was some degree of good that came out of it.
Right.
I think this is wild because I think this is part of the joy of, what the people that develop an enthusiasm for truly watching the game. And this is an interesting layer too that I've thought about of, I think a lot of the reason there's an affinity for people that like to follow college baseball is because it's not as polished it shouldn't be, of course. It's not as polished as the big league level that you typically see. That's the standard on television. But I think about when you take that to a high school degree, but then you're able to see the craziness at high school even being less refined, and then being 6 years younger than your older brother with the watchful eye of, yes, we watch big league ball all the time in our household. This is the way that we follow the game. We're used to this product. And then you're able to see something just absolutely wild that you don't really see causing that big of a walk-off moment. Evan, is that in your eyes? I mean, you were nodding your head like you can affirm this, but was there ever a moment that you really took a minute to look at your brother and realize that he was enjoying it just as much as you were?
Yeah, all the time. There was at our high school field, there was like a little area that was cut out for a bullpen on the outside of the fence on the first base line. And that was kind of where we warmed up. But nobody would ever sit in there except for people who felt that they had the ability to sit in there, right? Like kind of like a feel thing, like an unwritten rule. Like, okay, you have somebody on the team, you can sit like in the bullpen area. You'll move when there needs to be a kid to warm up. But like Easton would always stand there, and my dad would always go there, and they would bring or grab a bucket, and they would sit on the bucket. It's like in that area. It's a classic kind of thing. So when I was pitching, or a lot of times when I wasn't pitching, I would play short, and I would see them over there. So it'd be very obvious because they would sit out separately from, you know, the crowd.
Yeah.
So it's very obvious to me that they're there and they're watching. And then my grandpa would always stand directly behind home plate. He would never stand anywhere else. And I'm sure Easton knows that definitely, is that our grandpa would always bring a chair and sit right behind in the very middle of the backstop. He'd put his chair in front of everybody else, right up in front of the screen. Didn't matter who was behind him. So you knew, because of a family who's into baseball, you knew they took those spots. They took the spots that where you could see them and they were closest to the game. And when I was playing, it was very obvious because I could look and see, like, there's my grandpa, there's my dad, there's my brother, like all the
you're
things.
taking roll call exactly where they're going to be standing.
Yes. Well, I knew before the game, you know.
You know, there's a lot of special sides of this, and I think that, you know, when you recognize the tendencies of certain people, and we've talked about this at length on previous episodes, of when you start to recognize those tendencies in your teammates of, you know, sometimes the shy kid is the most, like, interesting person on the team. Sometimes, you know, the different quirks that people have, that's what makes them really unique. But I think the cool part about this is your family members have those unique quirks. There's those unique personality traits, but you see it all the time. And then you have a common bond that brings it together. And then you are so in tune with them that, I mean, you don't need to communicate with them like you do other people because you're just such on the same wavelength. And I think that's, you know, such a polished understanding, especially when you have such a diligent support system that is not only willing to support every facet of what it is that you do, but they also have such an unprecedented level of awareness to what it is that you're doing and what game that it is that you're playing, which I think is part of the really cool side of being in baseball families and recognizing those stories that come together. So I think of, you know, Evan, you've talked about this story at length, and I want to highlight this. I feel like I should ask permission for kind of saying this, but at the same time, it's a really cool story, and I'm sure you wouldn't be opposed to it. When you found out that you got picked up by the Mariners, and I want to ask this through Easton's eyes first, because I've heard you talk about this, and I selfishly want to hear Easton's side because I haven't heard it before. So can you walk us through when you found out that your brother was going to play minor league baseball? How did you find out, and how did that make you feel in the immediacy? Because you were at a field, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah. First of all, shout out to Gilbert Baseball because I think they're a part of every story so far. But yeah, I just got done. I think I was pitching that night. It was probably in July or so, or June maybe. And the draft had just ended, and it was, you know, sad moments just because there was a lot of uncertainty at that point. And I remember being on the road, and I was pitching that day, and it was kind of a far trip, but oddly enough, you know, Evan was there that night, and I wasn't sure why, just because it was a little bit of a trip, you know. And then I remember after the game, I just got done. I think it was a pretty dramatic one, too. We won in, like, extra innings or something. But anyway, after the game, I just remember walking over it as a normal conversation. And I was on the opposite side of the fence, and he just threw a lanyard over at me, this lanyard. And I just remember grabbing it, and it, like, took me a second. There's a video of it somewhere, but I look at it, and I'm looking at it like, why am I holding a Mariners lanyard? And then I look up at him, and it, like, hits me because he's just standing there with the biggest smile ever, right? And then I immediately
start getting, like, kind of emotional right here.
Yeah.
Man.
And then, so my whole team is right there too, but they don't know what's going on. But I immediately just, like, run over to the other side and just give him the biggest hug ever, and still just so confused. don't even know what it means yet still, but it was the coolest moment ever for that to happen.
Yeah. That's I might get kind of choked up here. Evan, you need to explain this through your eyes so that way I can take a minute to breathe. I mean, I know I've heard this before, but I mean, if you want to elaborate on it too, I imagine you got some details that you can throw in there.
Well, I was driving home from Omaha, and because we had just got back from the NCAA tournament, and
From the regional, yeah.
and I was listening to the draft on the radio for the 3 hours that I was driving home, and nothing happened. I get home and I turn the draft radio on the speakers in the living room, and my mom, my dad, and my brother are there, and we're listening to it, and nothing's happening, and the draft ends, and I was devastated. Like it was one of those moments where I just really like kind of hit the deck. But Easton had to leave shortly after. Like as soon as the draft ended, Easton left and went and got ready for the game and then went over there. Well, in between that time, while Easton was gone, I got the call that, I had a team that wanted to sign me. So, of course, I said yes right away. And I was like, all right, we're going to Easton's game tonight for sure because I leave tomorrow morning.
You're going, where else can I be? Yeah.
The turnaround is like that. It's like, okay, we're going to Easton's game tonight because I leave tomorrow morning. They told me, okay, you leave in this many hours. I said, all right, perfect. So me and my mom were on the way to Easton's game because my dad was working. And, well, first we went to see my dad, but at the store. But then we went up there. And we had to find a sporting goods store that had something Mariners.
No, and of course.
The only Mariners thing we could find was that lanyard. It's back there. And so that's what we got. And then we got there. I watched Easton play and was talking to people that I knew. And after Easton was done, I chucked it over the fence while the coach was talking to the team in the circle.
Well, the cool part about this too is that Evan, you went the entire game watching Easton, knowing this, but you knew that Easton didn't know at that moment, so you're just kind of like soaking it up, going, "Yeah, this is like." I think about how retrospective that is of like a moment frozen in time of just how pure and how like the way that you're able to recollect this, and then, oh, by the way, now I'm going to make my professional debut tomorrow, but he doesn't know this. We're just going to enjoy life for the time being. Yeah. Like, that's one of the most pure, like, concentrated moments of joy that I can only imagine. I do want to throw this in here of the way it was through my eyes, because I don't know if you guys even know this, and Evan, I don't even know if you do. We got back from that regional. I stayed in Omaha, but I needed to go play summer ball right away because, long story short, I didn't throw very much that year. I knew I wasn't going to get picked. I needed to go try to save my career. So I'm like in and out. I'm going up to Minnesota to play summer ball immediately. I needed to throw a bullpen because I hadn't thrown off of a mound in a little while. We were at the regional. I need to get my work in. We got back. It's 9:30 at night in Omaha. I turn our practice field lights on, and I'm throwing a bullpen by myself, and it was terrible. And it was because the draft had ended, and I was devastated about Evan. I had I'm throwing, and I'm like, all right, let's put this aside. And I remember, I don't want to kind of admit this because this is going to make me sound soft, but I was emotional when I was finished because not only did I throw like hell, but I'm just like, this doesn't make any sense. I drive to Minnesota the next morning. Get there in time for the night game. Our play-by-play broadcaster, Evan Hughes, which he will be a guest on this show, by the way. So, he doesn't know it yet, but he will be.
He does not know that.
He doesn't know this yet, but he is absolutely going to be on here. Evan Hughes is coming up, and he says, "Man, I'm just so happy for Evan Johnson." And I hadn't heard yet. So I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, he got picked up by the Mariners, and I broke down again, and I just gave Evan Hughes the biggest bear hug. I'm like, I don't know how you figured this out before me.
I don't know how
I was
did
in my
either.
own little world driving up north. I was and I don't know because I sent you a text afterwards, and I was just letting you know I was thinking about you, and I think the plan was you were potentially going to come up to St. Cloud with me, depending on what the situation looked like.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of just like I didn't want to be too like I was not that I wanted to give distance, but like I get how, there's not much to say piecing it together. I'll be here. I know you know I'll be here. But then when Evan Hughes was the one that told me, I don't know if I was more excited about that than I was maybe anything that I accomplished individually in my own career. Like I was in part because I didn't expect it. I had no clue. And then needless to say, I pitched pretty well that night. I remember I actually did have a pretty good outing, and I think it was in large part because, at that point I wasn't just playing for myself, it felt like. So I just wanted to throw that in there. The lanyard part is still a little bit cooler than my story, but I kind of wanted to share in the
That's
joy right
still a
there
very
because I
cool
look back on
story.
Right.
that. We talked about the big league side of things, and I know you guys mentioned the 2011 World Series of the way that the Cardinals were always relatively successful for quite a long time. And, you've talked about, I know on previous episodes, we've mentioned the road trips to St. Louis and, of course, watching games on TV. Is there anything similar, and then either one of you guys can take this, anything at the big league level that you guys really look back upon of, maybe a moment that a listener might remember in, call it Cardinals history or call it anything just within big league operation? Is there anything that stands out to you guys that you really think about as a defining moment that you guys shared very similar to that 2011 moment?
Yeah, I think one moment that Evan and I shared that really sticks out to me was, like we said earlier, back at our old house, a lot of Cardinal moments, but this one was in specific in the garage, and it was November, like we talked about. Probably shouldn't be in the either A, garage, or B, outside, because it's too cold, but we watched a famous Chris Carpenter complete game, and it was against the Phillies. I think the year after they had just won the World Series. I think they won it in 2010. But
Born in '08, was that
oh
right?
08, okay. Well, they had Jimmy Rollins and Chase Utley and all those dudes that were, battling for MVP within the same team. And I remember the Cardinals had barely made it in, and it was Game 5 of the NLDS. And I remember there being a bunch of crazy plays. Chris Carpenter diving into the first base bag head first, and just that complete game when we beat them in Philadelphia. I think that just brought another great fan moment, and really, I think, sparked the pitching love for the game, just because seeing a complete game in the playoffs, is kind of unheard of. But yeah, I think that just really sparked the love for the pitching side of things.
Well, also Chris Carpenter, like I remember we had a book fair when I was in elementary school, and they had posters, and one of the posters was Chris Carpenter. So of course, like I didn't look at anything else but that poster. Like I got the poster, and we put it up in the garage. So it was next to the TV, like during this game, and Chris Carpenter was. I feel like a lot of people might not remember this, but he was a dog in the sense of the word that it means to baseball. Like very aggressive, very high energy, and that was cool to see out of a pitcher because we didn't get that a lot, and a lot of people don't get that out of pitchers. It's kind of like the more mild-mannered composure, right?
Yeah,
Sort of
it's
mindset.
the non-Max Scherzer type of intensity. Yeah,
Right. Especially when you're a starter. Like a lot of starters are more so composed, mild mannered, whatever. But you had this starter that was like going at it almost like a Max Scherzer. And it's weird because two of my favorite pitchers would probably be Chris Carpenter and Max Scherzer, just because I love their attitude. I love there's a starter that's just
hard nosed.
Yeah, just hard nosed, just right in there every single pitch, And watching that game was like watching him even on the offensive side after the game had changed. It's just like he was there to win the game at any cost, and that was really cool to watch.
And he could swing a bat too, right? Like, I mean, he was one of the better
Little
hitters
bit.
in the National League among
Yeah.
pitchers, if I'm not mistaken.
A little bit, yeah.
It's funny too. You mentioned as far as like having somebody like that on the team that you cheered for, and I do kind of want to chime in my own perspective of me being a pitcher, growing up in Colorado with the elevation there, and historically speaking, the Colorado Rockies have not generally had, I'm not saying that they haven't had good starting pitching, but it's a little bit of a different story when you're 5,000 feet above sea level trying to secure those guys long term. So I think about, I mean, the jealousy involved. I mean, they had like Ubaldo Jimenez was good for several years. Aaron Cook was somebody that was there, but I think about, the rotation of Chris Carpenter and Adam Wainwright, and I mean a couple other guys that were horses, not only for just like those sweet spot of years, but like for a long time. Like I think of my favorite pitchers growing up were Chris Sale and Clayton Kershaw. So Sale's been pretty stable for, I mean, the better part of the last 10 years, that for that matter. I know some injuries have derailed him a little bit, but I followed Clayton Kershaw because he was a left-hander and I just loved the way that he worked. Intensity wise, he's a little different than Max Scherzer. I mean, it's not like there's anything wrong with it. It is what it is. But I think about, it's amazing too how like players will kind of modify them or kind of try to replicate, maybe not how they move or how they I mean certainly how they compete though. And I think about, we talked on our last episode about the more impactful people in the game of baseball, of what does it take to make an impact. I think that you could consider Bryce Harper in some capacities somebody that people look up to because he's changed kind of the outlook on what it means to play with some attitude. And there's certainly players like this. But I think of how cool is it? I don't want to get too far off the rails on this, but I want to attest to have a bulldog type of player like Chris Carpenter that you look up to that's on your team, and to realize the impact that that brings on the next generation of players like you guys that just go and take the mound and realize what it means like to compete with that same. I think that's a beautiful thing. I mean, this is why I wanted to talk about this, because this is why people love the game and this is why it deserves that level of spotlight. So I
Right.
want to kind of talk about different stories. Or you got something here? You go ahead if you want to jump in.
Well, I was gonna say, like you talked about at the break too, Madison Bumgarner. That intensity and that like drive to compete is just something that people fall in love with watching, just because it's fun to see them at the highest level working for like the highest reward, and they're being so intense, and that's why we all seem to love the same trait in those pitchers, is just the super intense. And I know you mentioned Kershaw, but he can be intense too a little bit. But
That's also true. That's
yeah,
very true. Well, and that's, I think the fun part about this is when you see a moment on the biggest scale, it makes you want to be a part of that at the biggest scale too. And this is kind of what I wanted to lead into talking about. I think what's really cool is when you meet people that are just as invested in the game of baseball as you are, and then you realize that they soaked in notable baseball moments just like you did, but the way that they soaked them in was just a little bit different, just because they were in a different setting or a different time and place. So I think of, I mean, I won't get too carried away with this. I'll just kind of list these off of moments where intensity was at an all-time high. I can remember when the Oakland A's clinched the AL West in 2011. It was a day game, and Grant Balfour was the closer for him. And the Balfour rage in the Oakland Coliseum was just, I
that's
remember
the
watching this
best.
live and thinking, like, everybody deserves one moment in life. And even non-baseball people, I wish everybody had at least one chance to know what it's like to come into a ballpark with 40,000 plus people with just heavy metal blowing the doors off the place for a save situation. Like, I mean, I wish everybody had a chance to see this.
You know
But
that
I think
PA
of, I
guy had
mean,
that volume button and he cranked
he
that
was,
thing.
for sure.
You know he was there for that. You know that.
whenever I'm having a rough day, I go and find that clip and I just rewatch it. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
Him throwing the
But I think
water
of,
and throwing it in his hat, and
that's right. I remember I was out of school early that day for some reason. I don't remember why, but so was my dad was home as well, which I don't know why, because it was a weekday afternoon, but for some reason we were both watching at the same time. But I think of, Evan, this is a moment that you guys have talked about, and I know that we've kind of collided different stories of maybe it didn't really have anything to do with the teams that we followed, but you talked about the perfect game or the non-perfect game that Armando Galarraga threw for the Detroit Tigers in 2010. And I know you've loosely talked about how you viewed that in your eyes and where it was just like, did that actually happen? Like, can you kind of tell the people about what was your account of that story and that situation through your eyes?
Well, what really hit me about that situation was not so much what happened that day, but what happened the day after. Where I'm pretty sure was it Jim Joyce?
Yeah. Jim Joyce.
Yeah,
You guys, I know you guys will know, but it was Jim Joyce, and they had Armando Galarraga take the lineup card out to home plate,
home plate meeting. Yeah,
right? Which that's kind of like a thing that you just usually do not do, right? It's always the manager, but in certain cases, sometimes you do. Like it's usually only a special scenario. But Jim Joyce having like tears in his eyes about that situation
and he like tapped him on the shoulder.
yes, while he's presenting the lineup card. It's like that creates a moment in baseball history that's so much different than an actual perfect game.
That's
right?
also true. Yeah.
But and it's the human aspect of baseball with the umpire and with the pitcher. The fact that Armando Galarraga was able to go out there and just be like, "Hey, it's okay," right? And Jim Joyce
that was so pure.
being like that, and just basically devastated by the fact that he didn't get that call right on a perfect game, and knowing it is the human aspect of baseball. And I mean, that's what we're talking about too with Scherzer, Carpenter, Clayton Kershaw, and a lot of the guys that we're mentioning, and how baseball is just so connected with the human experience of you have real umpires, real people, you have real players who are real people, and they make mistakes, both of them. And it creates an emotional aspect to the game, whether it's attitude of how you play or whether it's, you know, history changing like Armando Galarraga and Jim Joyce.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good point too, because I think about the perspective that that gave so many people. Like, I mean, it's funny, as you're saying that story, I can view this vividly, like just with the way that I remember seeing this and seeing the video from that. I remember that exact moment of Jim Joyce just tapping him on the shoulder, just patting him on the back. I mean, it was just like such an innocent thing of like, you did it, kid. And I remember the post-game interview of like Jim Joyce saying, I just cost that kid, and like willing to admit this. And I think about, you know, as you mentioned, that was even such a more pivotal moment in terms of, I remember that. I mean, if you ask me to name off the history of perfect games, I'm a nerd over this stuff because I just am fascinated by them, and I could probably name plenty of them. But if I'm naming them, that's probably, I mean, I'm going to say, well, there was one that didn't happen, but it should happen.
Correct.
And like, I'm going
Almost
to say
more
that
memorable.
probably at the top. Yeah. So I think that I remember, I think it's funny because your interpretation of this, and I can remember personally when I was, this happened, I believe, in 2010. So I was, I don't know, I had to be like 13 years old at the time, I think. And I was at practice. Just, I was at baseball practice when it happened. And we were in the mountain time zone. The game was in the eastern time zone. So this game's finished up. I get home, I'm changing out of my uniform from practice, and I go and I look at the TV in my mom and dad's room, which was kind of across the hallway from my room. And the TV's on, and I remember reading the ESPN bottom line. Now, if you had to write this in breaking news on the bottom line, how do you say this in anything less than like a paragraph and a half?
Right.
Like if you have to write this down and document it. So I remember seeing it flash across, and I caught it like halfway through, and then I'm like, what? Like, I mean, I'm trying to read the headline. Like, I mean, I couldn't. So, anyways, I remember just looking at this and then just being infatuated about just thinking this was one of the craziest things that I had seen. And, you know, again, it's unfortunate that it cost him the perfect game, but I think about those particular moments and what it meant for me when I was 13 years old. Of I see this, I recognize how much big the history is. I recognize the upstanding way that Jim Joyce presented himself in the aftermath and the grace that Armando Galarraga carried himself with. Those are stories that, this is kind of why I wanted to mention this, because I know that it impacted you guys just the same as it impacted me. So I think that's really a cool way of looking at this. And this was, whether it be different performances, and I think that favorite players are where this really comes into the equation. Like I know my dad's favorite player growing up was George Brett with the Royals. And my dad didn't really live close to Kansas City. He grew up in Michigan, but took a road trip out there. He saw George Brett his rookie year. George Brett goes on to play 76 seasons with the Royals or whatever it was. He was a dude, and that was my dad's growing up. So I know that we've mentioned, I mean, I know we've discussed kind of the Cardinal history on this, but Easton, I want to ask you this as far as some of your favorite players and some of the defining moments that made them your favorite players. And I know you could say Evan on this, which I guess you're kind of welcome to say that, but for the purpose of the discussion that we were just on, some of your favorite players, let's call it at the big league level, what were some of the defining moments that made them your favorite player?
I think the first thing that I can think of that is a non-Cardinal player is Derek Jeter, just because he had such an iconic, the defensive jump throw that he always made in the hole. And I think what really put it over the top was the way he ended his career. I don't know if you remember this, either of you, but with the walk-off base hit in his final at-bat as a Yankee, I think that was probably the coolest moment that I have seen. And I think that's just such an iconic player that changed the game and always played super hard. And I think that's number one for me, for sure, is Derek Jeter. It's up there. For pitchers.
I remember. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yeah. For pitchers, I'd say Randy Johnson, probably, just because he was such a dominant figure and everybody was just in such fear of when he would toe the rubber. And so at such a down angle, he'd throw, he'd scare lefties out of their shoes every at bat. So,
I think that it's important to highlight just how big Easton actually is. That I don't think it's a drastic comparison to mention that he has a very similar body type to what you're going to see out of Randy Johnson. So I wish that the viewers actually did recognize this.
We are
But I mean,
not
like you're
the
mentioning,
same height. We are not the same height.
like knowing the context behind this, I mean, it's so much cooler recognizing. But for viewers at home or wherever you may be, like recognizing that level of comparison, and I think this is something that, a story that I'll kind of throw in with my own development where I was growing up. Of when I was early in high school, we drove from Denver to Phoenix for spring training, and this was before Chris Sale was really on the scene. But my dad said, there's a guy starting for the White Sox tomorrow that we're going to go see, and I think you're going to want to see him. And I hadn't really been familiar with him because this was just kind of on the back end of his late prospect status before he was kind of a routine big leaguer. We went and we saw him start a spring training game, and I saw the way his body moved and the way he rotated and how it was very similar to my arm slot, and I was instantly hooked. Like I have video of this still on my phone from being in the bullpen before the game, going and checking this out, and how much that helped define, my affinity for, checking out different mechanics, checking out different body movement patterns, how people are able to rotate efficiently. I think a lot of this is attributed back to this moment because I not only saw the presentation and the stage that he was allowed to take, but it was a moment between my father and I that he really highlighted the cool moments that came out of that. So, Evan, I also want to highlight this. I understand the Randy Johnson comparison. It kind of applies to Easton more than it would apply to somebody like myself. But did you ever really notice, did you guys kind of follow a lot of the similar players? And were the players that you guys were the most passionate about? Did you always feel like there was kind of a connection between who he was the biggest fan of and who you were?
Usually, a lot of times our favorite players were different. Like I would say my favorite player on the 2006 team for the Cardinals when we were growing up, we were big Cardinal fans, was probably David Eckstein. Just because I was small.
No Pujols love there? Whoa.
Well, Pujols is good, but like he's Albert Pujols. Of course he's good. But
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Everybody knew who he was. Yeah, that's
now
fair.
you talk about David Eckstein, I always kind of liked the underdog sort of players or the players with attitude. And I don't know, Easton, could you tell me kind of your favorite players throughout MLB history?
I'd say probably number one is Pools, just because he was my whole life. He played my entire lifetime.
Yeah.
But definitely, I think number two, it might be an interesting one, but Lance Berkman. I just love the dirty
That's a
way
good
he
one.
played, and just like
Yeah,
he's kind of a hard-nosed player and just really gritty on the field, I feel like. So
I respect that right there. That's actually a good dude. That's funny. I heard a story that was talking about. I think this was Clayton. It was Kershaw. He was on the Dan Patrick show one day, and he was talking about Dan Patrick point blank asked him. He said, "How do you feel about the movement of like the Juan Soto's or the Bryce Harpers of the world that are not afraid to really show their attitude and show the way that they play? Like, how do you feel about it?" He just point blank asked Kershaw. And Kershaw answered what I thought was the most graceful response that he could give. And it was, it's not that they're bad players and it's not that they should or shouldn't do it. But if my kid were to follow somebody, it would be my preference that they followed the way that a I'm trying to think of the player that he actually said. It was, oh, he was saying the way that like a Paul Goldschmidt plays, or the way that somebody that's a little bit, maybe not as, I don't want to say aggressive because I don't think there's anything wrong with playing aggressive, but the flashiness of a Bryce Harper versus the presentation of what a Paul Goldschmidt might put on the table. I thought that was a really cool way of formulating a message of, who would you want to date your daughter, Bryce Harper or Paul Goldschmidt? I mean, I know what my answer would probably be, and that I'm not disrespecting anybody with that. I'm not meaning that to be poor. That might have sounded a little slanderous. I'm sorry. That wasn't what I mean. I'm standing behind what I said,
That
but
is a
point
bullpen.
being,
That is a typical bullpen
it
question.
is.
That is a bullpen
that's
conversation
a good one.
question.
If your daughter had a big leaguer, who would you pick? Well, no, I mean I like that though because Lance Berkman, that's a name that that was an era that I mean I know Evan and I grew up in, and kind of on the tail end of the big impact that he was making. But I think it's interesting to really recognize the persona of people and who they tend to gravitate to. I remember hearing a story. I actually read this on Instagram the other day. It was a youth soccer player that scored a goal, and he like kissed his hand and pointed to the heavens. And then some parent went over to the kid's parents. Is like, "Is everything okay?" Like he pointed. Did you guys have like a relative pass away or something? No, his favorite soccer player did that, and now he does it all the time. Like that was the way it was. But when you see I mean, I know that's kind of a cheesy method of influence that you can really reminisce back on. But I think of, when I was younger, I remember seeing that I wanted to be a closer. Like I thought it would be the coolest thing ever to be a closer, and that was part of where the Grant Balfour moment. I mean, I remember looking back on that thinking, I want to be that guy. And then I remember I got a little too amped up a couple of times in Little League games that I was like, maybe I got to tone it down a bit. And that was when Kershaw ultimately became my guy and who's who I like to watch. But, it's fun to see this. And I think more importantly, and this is something that I do want to tie in because, I don't want to kind of separate us from the dynamic that we started the first half of this episode with. And that's talking about being brothers and the 6-year age difference of recognizing how, constantly ahead of you in the day-to-day life of what Evan was leading. It's very easy to, I don't want to say replicate because of course you guys are your own individual people with your own abilities to take care of business. But I think that a really cool outlook on this is not only do you have these moments where you're recognizing these levels of big leaguers, that how they operate, but you're also seeing it directly with each other on how you guys can keep each other in check, how you guys can encourage others to be the best versions of yourselves. And, for Evan to be able to be the role model and the influence, and for Easton to be able to follow in the footsteps and to match the work ethic of somebody a couple years ahead of him. I think those are the real big reasons on why I wanted to pose these kind of discussions, is because I recognize that it's a lot more than just what you see on a day-to-day basis, but those things can magnify based on the memories that you really share. So I want to hear more about your guys' upbringing. Like, I mean, I know was there ever like a fight playing wiffle ball or something? Like, I mean,
Oh,
I'm trying to think of
oh,
these are
so
good
many
ones. I
fights.
imagine you guys gotta have something
So
there.
many fights. Was there ever a fight? Serious. So many fights. So many.
I mean, you gotta have like a case story. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but is there any show appropriate ones that you guys can put on the table?
Oh gosh, I can't remember. We'd probably fight all the time. We'd fight
Yeah.
every other
Yeah.
day. And most of the time it was me pestering Easton. Probably. And then as soon as he got bigger,
Oh
I
my
stopped.
goodness. It's just a good time. That's what it's about right there, man. Yeah, I was gonna say, all of a sudden he starts catching up to that. Kind of happened with my brother and I. I remember that my aggression was a little bit more timid until I felt like I could kind of go toe to toe with him at a certain point. But
Yeah.
it's that's part of the fun. It's all part of it. And I think the joy of it too, especially just being guys living in the same house, is just, hey, you good? Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, that was all right. And then you just move on and it is what it
Yeah.
is. But no, it's good stuff, man. And it's fun to really highlight those things and it's fun to keep putting it together. But needless to say, before we get too carried away, I want to turn this over to Easton one final time. And I want to keep this open-ended because, we've had quality discussion as always. This is an absolute blast. Is there anything that, I'll turn the floor over to you. Is there anything that you want to promote? Anything that you want to put out there? Anything that you want the people of the world to know about you? I'll just turn this over to an open forum that anything you got, we'll give you the floor, my friend.
I just want to, well, first, thank you guys for having me on the show. I hope to be back again. But one thing that I just want to leave off with is everybody have fun with whatever you're doing in baseball. And this doesn't just apply to this sport. And I know we only talk about baseball, but have fun in whatever you're doing. So work hard at it.
Very well said, and continuing to update and elevate the spirit of passion and perseverance in this game of baseball. We knew that we wanted to make sure that we had tremendous discussion points, and I can say he's just as good of a speaker as he is a pitcher, and he's a pretty darn good pitcher too. Easton Johnson joining the program. An absolute privilege. As always, you guys know Evan from routine episodes, but the two brothers joining us, and you say you hope to be back. Easton, I can guarantee you will be back on
I want to say
episode,
episode
so
16.
we
Why
didn't-
not?
I mean, we might as well. We could. I mean, you never
Let's
know.
do it.
I mean, it went pretty well. I mean, I say that we got to keep it rolling. So you
Gear
never know
up,
right
everybody.
there. It's always a privilege. We are so happy that we not only have the two voices that are normally on your screens, but adding a third voice here into episode 15. A huge tip of the cap to Easton Johnson, our special guest. Also, tip of the cap to the older brother, co-host Evan Johnson. My name is Justin Wick. This has been episode 15 of The Night Pitch. Thank you guys so very much for tuning in. Make sure to check us out on the social channels. Keep showing us some love all over the place, and we will see you guys next time.
You will so much in love.